without further ado, I call upon Giselle to open the case for the proposition.
Simply hasn't dissipated. We don't see the political success translating into social integration. And as we celebrate, as we mourn rather, the 10th anniversary of the car bomb in Oman in 1998, which killed 29, we recognise the persistence of that tension and we acknowledge the severity of those tensions within communities in Northern Ireland, within the 6 counties that chose to stay with the United Kingdom. We say that the factors perpetuating that tension are not ones of religious expression or of choice, but of habit. And that is never a justification for perpetuating antagonism within societies, and it's absolutely where we cast the role of government in this instance. The status quo in Northern Ireland at the moment is that the demographic split is roughly 45% Catholic and 55% Protestant. So we say that within communities, the typical model of education is that there are 2 schools that are both government funded. One is typically attended by Catholics and one is typically attended by Protestants, for no other reason than habit and safety in numbers, ladies and gentlemen. And those factors that are motivating that choice are harming social unity as a whole, and that's the problem that we identify this morning, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't a mandated thing. It's not like the 2 schools are actually different in any significant way. It's just a practice that has become institutionalised out of habit. So the model that we propose today is that each school in each regional community is required to have a 40% quota of Catholics and a 40% quota of Protestants, such that students who attend these schools declare which group they feel themselves to be part of, or they can declare nothing at all. The fact of the matter is that forced desegregation can only happen with a quota, and that's the mechanism that we use today. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk to you about 2 things. The first is the role of schools in education, and the second is how there's no harm to religious expression and how social unity is a goal of every government. So, to begin my substantive matter, the role of schools and education is complex and has many facets. So firstly, we recognise that governments use schools to achieve social ends all the time. Governments use schools to equip youth for later life. That's the purpose of government-funded education, because the government recognises the responsibility that it owes to its youngest and citizens with most potential. At the status quo, the problem that persists in Northern Ireland is that these children have no experience of the other in the classroom. Pardon me, we think that has 2 flow-on negative effects. Firstly, we think that segregation persists through university, and we know that most Protestants attend Queen's in Belfast, and most Catholics go to Dublin and attend Trinity College. So we think that that is a perpetuation that's artificial and that's particularly damaging, especially in a climate where Ireland is participating in a number of cross-border institutions, it's engaging in the EU more than it ever has, and we think that it's particularly crucial at this time in Ireland's development that it be able to develop relationships across borders. The second aspect of the role of schools and education is that governments recognise the power of the combination of youth and education to break down prejudice, because the particular character of the classroom is one that isn't experienced anywhere else in the life of a child. So first of all, there's exposure to the other. Second of all, it's within a disciplined environment. And third of all, it's with the common goal of education. So it's a place where these differences are necessarily set aside and commonality is underlined. We think that's the particular power of the classroom to break down prejudice. And that's why we absolutely think that government should step in this way. I'll take it.
In a liberal society, given that these quality of educations are the same, why shouldn't people have the right to choose whatever school they want to go to, regardless of their reasons?
Well, the reason is the imperative that I just spent 4 minutes outlining, which is that a homogenous viewpoint within schools, no experience of the other within schools, is an artificial perpetuation of antagonism. I'm going to go on to tell you why there's no harm to religious expression in a moment. So, why is the power of youth and education particularly crucial in this instance? It's because it's the best place to foster tolerance. We understand that governments, can't get into people's heads and tell them what to think. We absolutely don't support something like that, and we don't want to run roughshod over free choice. But what we do say is that tolerance must be fostered at its earliest and most meaningful stage in a person's development, and the most appropriate place for that to happen is within a classroom. The second harm of the status quo is the harm of the homogenous viewpoint, and we think that when children aren't exposed to others, like within their community even, within a classroom, it means that the 300 history of hatred persists, and that antagonism does can't break down without some sense of exposure. And I've outlined the reasons why the classroom is the best place for that exposure to take place. Yes, I'll take it.
If the school already entails a particular curriculum and all these schools adopt this curriculum, how is that a homogeneous viewpoint?
Okay, there's a difference between the content taught within schools and the homogeneous social practices and social views talked about and discussed and accepted at schools. We think those are very important differences, and moreover, we don't think that it's that solid that curriculums can be dictated to be the same across schools, and we think that it's crucial that there are other constituents within the classroom to maintain a balanced perspective within the curriculum as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, further, we also say that the role of government is never to bow to social prejudice or to social antagonism, and it's never to minimise harm, but is to mobilise against it. And I've told you why education and the classroom are the most powerful tools at the government's disposal to do so. So why is there no harm to religious expression under this model? First of all, there's no bar to private practice of religion. Obviously, these children and these families and these communities are free to practice religion elsewhere in their private time. But I've told you why the particular role of the classroom precludes that expression from reaching the goal that the government sets for education, which is equipping youth for later life and equipping them to be functioning members of a society that is harmonious. The second reason why there's no harm to religious expression is because there's not enough difference in doctrinal practice between Catholics and Protestants to justify a segregation in the classroom. It's not as though they're incapable of learning together because there's a fundamental schism in the way that they see the world. That's not the case, ladies and gentlemen. They're perfectly capable of understanding the curriculum and learning together, and we think that there's no harm to religious expression there either. Finally, we don't think there's a harm of religious expression under this model for a third reason, and that's because the classroom is the best place to emphasise the commonality that exists between these two groups. When the aim is like a common one, when education is the primary focus of discourse in the classroom, we think that it's an absolute lesson that gets learned, an ancillary one to the content that gets discussed in the classroom. That is, teachers' tolerance and that exposure that breaks down the false antagonism that's perpetuated under the status quo. Ladies and gentlemen, why we believe in this model is because the political integration hasn't translated into social integration, and that's persisting and it's causing harms. The best place for the government to deal with this problem is in schools. That's where mandate lies, and that's where absolutely should begin to act.
Thank you, Sal, for that speech. And if everyone's ready, I call upon Khalida to open the case for the opposition.
Here, here.
Comes up here and tells us that the problem of segregation within the community in Northern Ireland is one that doesn't translate into social cohesion. These individuals just don't normally hold hands in streets, and it creates some kind of harm. But we haven't heard what exactly these harms are, because they were very abstract, Mr. Speaker. We agree very much with the statement by the Prime Minister, which is that the difference or segregation of individuals within society now is not of religious expression, but because of habit, Mr. Speaker. So we feel this situation is tolerable because this situation doesn't translate in violence, doesn't translate in riots, Mr. Speaker, and doesn't translate into greater problems into society. We feel this is a tolerable situation, and the government should maintain this balance, Mr. Speaker, that has been achieved within society, and only encourage organic change within the society, Mr. Speaker. We feel a government should carry the force of encouragement of these individuals, to encourage these students to actually make schools, but we feel a kind of quota only enforces the kind of fear within society that the problem is of religious expression, Mr. Speaker, because we feel this model antagonizes the kind of balance that is already achieved within society. We feel, Mr. Speaker, that at the end of the day, although they proposed a quota, we felt there was no kind of enforcement mechanism, or there was no kind of way in which we see how these schools would actually get these students if they are normally comfortable in their schools, Mr. Speaker. We felt that part wasn't clarified by the Prime Minister. But let's deal with a few argumentations before I move on to what we want to talk about. Primarily, first, the right of individuals to actually choose which type of schools they want to be for whatever reasons, Mr. Speaker, and why the primary role of education is to teach students, and there should be nothing to disrupt that, Mr. Speaker. And then we will take a look at how this force, or this element of force by the government, creates the adverse effect that they want to achieve in today's debate, Mr. Speaker. But let's take a look first at the role of schools, because she seems to think that the role of schools is a national or a broader agenda, Mr. Speaker, to achieve social ends. Although we agree to some extent, we feel this should not be at the expense of the primary role of school, which is to educate these individuals, Mr. Speaker, based on the curriculum and based on what the students need to learn to school to achieve a greater end at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker. But we feel this is important because we feel the moment that you introduce or politicize education in this way, Mr. Speaker, that you feel that you need to force these individuals to segregate, force the individuals to sit next to each other, we feel it will disrupt the most primary objective, and we'll elaborate further on that. But the second question then is, will this proposal work, Mr. Speaker? Because we haven't heard of an analysis of how just because these individuals go to the same school, they'll suddenly hold hands and be friends, Catholics and Protestants, Mr. Speaker. In fact, if we look at the realities of high school or primary school even, Mr. Speaker, there are things like cliques, and there are things, there are groups of friends, Mr. Speaker, of which individuals normally stay within the comfortable group of friends anyway.
Yeah.
Therefore, we feel if we introduce a quota of 45% or 50-50, Mr. Speaker, these 50% will still stick into what is comfortable if you feel this habit is one that has been practiced for 300 years. We feel, in fact, Mr. Speaker, what is the problem of the homogeneous viewpoint that they were talking about? If you yourself agree that the curriculum of these schools were actually ones that standard within the country, Mr. Speaker, we feel that is primarily something that hasn't been clarified from that side of the house. In fact, we disagree with this idea that it doesn't harm religious teachings because it's a standard curriculum. We feel some schools do decide to inject education in terms of religious education and do decide to inject some form of Protestant or Catholic teachings, Mr. Speaker, and we feel we don't want to disrupt this. Before I go on, yes.
Adam, first of all, the mixing that happens is firstly you learn that the other is like you and not demonized as you pick up from the rest of your social environment. Secondly, you can't spend 12 years in a classroom beside someone and not make links with that person in a context where you would never make that link in any other area of your social life.
No, Mr. Speaker. We feel that link cannot be forced between individuals even if you put them next to each other. And we'll tell you why further in our argumentation. Because we feel, firstly, it's the right of these individuals to be comfortable if they choose to go to whatever school they want to, Mr. Speaker. To be educated in, if they choose, in a particular doctrine within society, or specifically whichever school they decide to go to. Because it's fun. Because we feel some schools do inject these things, Mr. Speaker, and if it's fundamental to their belief that they should go to this school, Mr. Speaker, we feel they should do so. Because we feel the kind of antagonism that you create within the particular school is one that disrupts this primary agenda of actually learning, Mr. Speaker. We feel if parents become uncomfortable and you feel these parents are the one who has helped 300 years of hatred or discomfort, Mr. Speaker, we feel the reaction of these parents would be to actually pull out these children from school if they feel that their children will be subjected to any kind of discomfort within their school, Mr. Speaker. But we feel the more dangerous effect that is, Mr. Speaker, because we feel this force that they create actually creates the adverse effect. Because we feel, if you agree that the problem right now is something that is of habit and not of religious expression, we feel the kind of move that exists in the government today is one that heightens and highlights unnecessary tension between
Sam to continue the case for the opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. We have an opposition today who conceded that antagonism remains, conceded that antagonism between communities is detrimental, believe that organic change would happen to solve that, but don't believe in any government action that would speed up that organic change, or indeed would even create an environment in which that organic change was happening. Because they were able to point to no other social environment in which this organic change is taking place, nor were they able to point to any other mechanisms which are permitting that organic change to take place. I'm going to look at two substantive arguments in due course. First of all, the role of government that is specifically to enforce social norms to change where that leads to benefits to society, and then I'm going to go on to look at the specific benefits to each community that this change will incur. First of all, though, let's look at what they had to say. They said, first of all, the status quo is tolerable because there aren't any riots. Mr. Speaker, we say that's a pretty freaking low bar to be setting for tolerance. We say that what you have in Northern Ireland is de facto segregation between Protestants and Catholics from birth to grave, Mr. Speaker. We say that particularly in an environment where social prestige and economic prestige still remains with the Protestant portion of the population, that is a fundamental harm, firstly to the Catholic minority, but more importantly to society as a whole. It's the reason why Northern Ireland is the least economically developed province of the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker. It's because functionally the workforce does not operate as a whole. We also didn't see any harms in the change that they pointed to. They said, oh, it'll be a terrible thing, why don't we just leave it? They didn't actually say what harms were occasioned. No, thank you, as a result. First of all, they said the role of school shouldn't be to achieve social engineering at the expense of the curriculum. We told you why there is no expense to the curriculum. We told you they follow the same courses. There is no religious education in these schools. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, we say that there is massive precedent for this. The government funds scholarships, for example, to schools in rich areas for poor kids that can't afford to go to them. The government often funds scholarships for poor kids to go to private schools because they don't have the money. Why? Because the government believes that firstly they deserve a chance, and secondly, more importantly, that there is benefit in exposing kids from those two communities to each other at an early age, so that in due course social integration is earned. More importantly, the lack of that kind of social engineering means that you do have a permanent division created between those groups, and that is detrimental to society on that side.
When parents feel like they have less cultural control over their children, aren't they more likely to more aggressively transmit their biases? And they feel like they
Thank you very much, sir. We say, first of all, in Northern Ireland, the cultural bias is transferred extremely aggressively at the moment. We actually don't believe it will get much worse. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we also deny the claim that parents will do that. We believe, as we've said, that this current situation is one of habit, that these are not rational hatreds that are being transmitted. People are far more alike than they know. The problem at the moment is they don't have a chance to encounter the other, to see how like them the other really is, to see how normal the other really is. And once they do that, once they mix in a daily situation for 12 years of education, Mr. Speaker, they will see how that happens. The problem with the opposition team is that what we are doing is we are creating the circumstances that will allow that organic change that they want, and frankly that we want, to actually happen. They've given you no mechanism by which their organic change will actually take place. Secondly, their point that says, oh, but parents will hate this. That's the antagonism that we need to break down. If you ever need physical proof of where the antagonism lies and how that is perpetuated, it's in the fact that parents might get a little bit pissed off. And what we're going to say is that government does have a role to break that down, and what it does particularly is have a role for successive generation. We say it's possible that parents will be a little bit peeved. That happens sometimes. They need to suck it up when that's what the government chooses is best for society as a whole, and as I'm going on to show, the government does that a lot of the time. And nor are we attacking fundamental beliefs, which is the last point on that side. We're attacking habits, Mr. Speaker. No, thank you. We believe that the government has to start somewhere. What they need to do is enforce social norms to change when they're detrimental to society. No, thank you. What that does is it increases the agency of all individuals within society. Let's look at some examples of where they've done that. No, thank you. The government does things like increasing drink driving laws, but also enforcing drink driving social changes, such that it's no longer a socially acceptable thing to do. Why? Because it causes harm to others in society. Same with smoking indoors, Mr. Speaker, as we see recently. They also enforce mandatory physical education in schools, because they recognise that the choice not to participate in sport is one which is detrimental not only to yourself, but also to society as a whole through health crises and through issues in the future. Governments choose to integrate social housing and council housing into areas of different economic backgrounds. Why? Because they believe that integrating communities there and the integration that results from co-location are of benefit. They introduce care in the community for mental patients. Why? Because they believe that the social harm and breaking down, again, that perception of the other as different and bad will be lost if you force integration. That's why we put mental patients back into the community, to ensure that they can live normal lives and be perceived as normal. In other words, this is part and parcel of what government does all the time. No, thank you, sir. Therefore, the government does and can step in, has a mandate to override choice. This is your point, sir. Override individual choice where that choice leads to a detriment for the rest of society as a whole. And we do see, no thank you, that where the harms come from. We see it, for example, in racism, when you have places in Australia which are 100% communities, 100% white in Cronulla, living next to communities which are not, no thank you. The de facto segregation leads to tension and intolerance between communities. But what will the actual benefits be? I've covered the fact that you perceive the other as more like you, and that you will make links just by being co-located for that period of time. For Catholics, the benefits are pretty good. You get that entry into social networks, economically and socially. Prestige. What that leads is long-term access to economic advancement, something which has been denied for far too long to the Catholic community in Northern Ireland. For the Protestants, what you get is access, again, to a social network. This time not so much within Northern Ireland, but more cross-border, Mr. Speaker. Because Catholics in Northern Ireland tend to go to university in Dublin and tend to be the ones that dominate cross-border institutions, which are growing after the Good Friday Agreement, we say that it's very important for there to be links for the Protestants into that community. Essentially, what we show is that both economically, politically, and socially, the benefits of integration are huge. We are seeing, Mr. Speaker, a political change, and praise be that political change seems to be working. We do still see sporadic violence. We still see stones being thrown at parades, Mr. Speaker. We believe the way to deal with the fundamental hatreds in society is to ensure that the next generation loses those habits of hatred. I'm proud to propose.
I thank Sam for that speech, and I call upon Mayor to continue the case for the opposition.
Mr. Chair, the fact of the matter is, realistically, there's no one society which it's the individuals who are in that society is completely at peace with each other. I mean, it's quite impossible for us to defend a situation where we will at all costs defend a society which is completely peaceful and there's no kind of hatred altogether. We say, Mr. Speaker, for us to have to prove that the society within Northern Ireland as of now is one which has no violence whatsoever, or no hatred whatsoever, is almost impossible to prove in the first place. But we can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that situations in the society within Northern Ireland is improving and is far much better than what it was, Mr. Speaker, 300 years ago, in fact 10 years ago, Mr. Speaker. And we say that if really what they wanted was such a drastic change in the entire framework of education in Northern Ireland to tackle such a grave problem, Mr. Speaker, we really needed to hear at least some objective criteria as to what they wanted to achieve and what exactly the problem was that was so perpetuated within society that they wanted to tackle. Instead, what we heard, Mr. Speaker, from opening government, especially in the second speaker, was sporadic examples of things that are not right within society. Sporadic examples of things which could have been better in society, Mr. Speaker. We had things like, there are no riots, and he felt felt that the bar is quite low if we only predicated our assumptions on the materialization of riots. He talked about things like economic prestige only lying in the hands of the Protestants, and we heard things like, there are no such real, that there are people throwing stones at parades, the speaker sit down. We say to the speaker that true, these are all isolated or disjointed examples of things that went wrong within society. But we don't know whether that proposal that they proposed, the speaker, is really going to tackle specifically any one of these problems. We say to the speaker that if you want to talk about something which is really needed, they had to at least have the decency to show to us that there is one grave problem, and this is how we are planning to solve it with our proposal. We don't like to have to tackle with sporadic problems and sporadic examples of things that are going wrong in the society, because we don't think, Mr. Speaker, it's fair for us to just to have to argue that everything is right, Mr. Speaker. Sit down. But we feel further, Mr. Speaker, that if you really want to talk about, and if you really wanted us to prove that whether society is improving, we tell you, Mr. Speaker, that things like inter-religion marriage, especially in Northern Ireland, has become, Mr. Speaker, something very popular amongst both Protestants and Catholics. We say, Mr. Speaker, if anything, marriage in itself can and is the most objective criteria to at least show that society is integrating. We say, Mr. Speaker, there exist many second and third generation young individuals who come from a marriage which included both a Protestant and a Catholic mother, Protestant and a Catholic parents, speaker. So we say that if anything, speaker, we don't really see the kind of antagonism that they were talking about materializing in society. So now, we say further, speaker, in arguing and tackling this idea of government has always engineered society. This is something that was argued by second opening government, speaker. We say that this argument that the government will always engineer society is very much a template argument to almost any debate, speaker, because he gives example of things like, we always put mental patients back into society because we want to achieve some sort of normality for these mental patients, and we always override church, speaker. We say that number one, it's a very template argument to many debates, but we say further, speaker, that this argument assumes that in status quo, that the Protestants and Catholics themselves are living in complete bubbles and in complete isolation of each other. We say, speaker, that the existence of mass media, the existence of interaction in the cities, Mr. Speaker, and interactions, Mr. Speaker, that exist outside schooling hours is not exactly pointing to the direction that these individuals are living in complete bubbles. So we say, Mr. Speaker, that again, the kind of drastic change that they were talking about is not really needed. And we told you in the opening and leading opposition speech, Mr. Speaker, that the kind of drastic change that they were talking about only exacerbates the problem, because it only points into the direction that society isn't integrating, and people will fear that will fear the drastic change that they were proposing. Yes, closing.
Didn't it require a change in the political system which forced the political parties to cooperate in order to actually get any sort of political progress in Stroma? Why is it any different in society?
Yeah, but the difference was that in that age and in that time that you were talking about, these individuals were at the two extreme ends of things. But we don't think that that's the situation right now in status quo. We don't think it's fair for you to say that people in Northern Ireland right now is exactly the same as they were 300 years ago when you created that deal that you were talking about. We don't think that's the situation within status quo. And it's not realistic for you to argue that, Mr. Speaker. Sit down. Let's look at what they didn't tackle. They didn't talk about the drastic changes that we were talking about and the kind of backlashes that we were talking about. And this is why I extend further on how we feel that what they are proposing is merely a form of paternalism on the part of the government, Mr. Speaker, which perpetuates cultural biases because you increase the fear of drastic changes within society, Mr. Speaker. Because you say that what you're doing under their model, Mr. Speaker, is you're taking a non-existent problem and you're saying that we have the ultimate right to based on the notion that we want to promote cultural change, Mr. Speaker, and do whatever we want with the kind of framework of education that we have within status quo. We told you, Mr. Speaker, that if you do this without sufficient justification, what you do, Mr. Speaker, within status quo is that number one, you increase cultural bias simply because you now point towards the direction that there exists some sort of difference between the Protestants and Catholics, when clearly, Mr. Speaker, it's not as grave as you wanted to make it sound in the first place. We say further, Mr. Speaker, what is more dangerous is that when you point in the direction of this difference, and this difference lies in religion, Mr. Speaker, Speaker, we say that what you're doing is that you're automatically saying that the method that you employ to teach these individuals in your respective Catholic and Protestant schools, Mr. Speaker, are things which are fundamentally wrong because simply it doesn't promote some sort of higher principle value that the government thinks should be there within society. We say, Mr. Speaker, that if a person who runs a Protestant school or runs a Catholic school or tries to somehow or rather put in certain religious elements in his teaching and decides to teach an individual based on that doctrine, Mr. Speaker, we say that that person should have the right to do so, especially when the parents have consented to sending their child into that school. We say, Mr. Speaker, that if the person teaching feels that A, B, and C using Protestant ideals is the right way to teach a person and is the best way to bring a person up in life, Mr. Speaker, we think that the government is saying that these kind of schools should be either closed down or should be changed in any way, Mr. Speaker, to include some sort of other external elements, only points into the direction that the method of teaching that you employ is effectively wrong and cannot be tolerated within society. And we don't think, Mr. Speaker, that what the Protestants and Catholics and whatever they're teaching in these schools are exactly that wrong to begin with, Mr. Speaker. And we don't think, Mr. Speaker, it exacerbates the problem in any way that much that they try to portray it as, Mr. Speaker. With all that saying, then, thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
I thank Mayor for that speech, and I call upon Alex to continue the case.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my speech, I'm going to talk about two things, and rebuttal and extension will be interwoven within it, and I will delineate as I go along. The two things that I will talk about is indoctrination and how enforced cooperation can actually solve for the problems and create a system of political pluralism. But the second thing that I'm going to talk about is a government standard for intervention, and we're going to extend from the harm that they talked about, how government is justified in trying to solve harms in society, and extend it to why government is justified in intervening to promote equal opportunity in society, and why the current political situation in Northern Ireland particularly requires the government to intervene for the sake of equal opportunity and the sake of the schools. So the first thing that I want to talk about is indoctrination and forced cooperation and how that can lead to political pluralism. Now, this whole debate has sort of been about whether you can throw children into a school and that this will actually make them better members of society, whether this can actually allow them to better peacefully coexist in society. And on our side of the house, I don't think it's our burden to prove that we can throw people into schools and make them love each other. I don't think that's anything that any government could ever do. But I do think that government can, through forced cooperation, make members of society better able to peacefully cooperate. And the way that we're going to extend this into the debate is by bringing up the political analogy of how the political system in Northern Ireland was changed, and how through forced cooperation in the political system, we actually saw political pluralism in Northern Ireland for the first time in 300 years, and actually were able to make progress. And it wasn't 300 years ago. It was actually only a couple of years ago, when in Vermont, they introduced the Dawn system of electoral politics, in which the largest party in the parliament would receive the first ministry of government, but the second largest party in parliament would then be able to get a ministry of government, and then they would alternate, sharing the government, being forced to share the government, even though one party did not receive a majority, but in fact were the minority. They were forced to cooperate within the government because of the political system. What happened as a result of this? Because they were forced to cooperate, or they would fail, these political parties formally rival armies in a civil war of sorts. The Troubles in Northern Ireland were forced to cooperate. Ian Paisley was forced to cooperate with Sinn Féin. The Protestants were forced to allow the Catholics to run the schools. In this way, because failing to cooperate would mean failure of the society, these groups were forced to cooperate. Now, I think it was a long shot when it happened, but it worked with these adults. We think it would be doubly easy, in fact, much easier to make it work with children, for many reasons. First of all, these children are not built in with the same kind of historical prejudices that the people who are actually fighting in these wars, throwing the bombs and the mines and things like that, as these children are. These children have much more of a blank slate in these sorts of situations, and such have a higher potential to actually become peaceful, cooperating members of the society. But furthermore, this is another situation in which all the actors in the situation have the incentive to cooperate, because failure in school will mean the failure of the society in the long run. So we think that forced cooperation will provide the incentives for these groups to actually create a more peaceful society, to have a better peaceful political situation in the long run, particularly since the education system is what leads into the political system in the long run. What's another example of this working in the Western liberal democracies. In the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, for many decades, the political system was pillarized into 4 separate groups: liberals, socialists, Catholics, and Protestants. And yes, for a very long time, there was tension in society between these groups. But it was only until government structures forced these groups to cooperate when these groups actually did cooperate. Because if they were given the easy option of separation, they were able to continue to segregate themselves. And as I'm going to talk about in my next point, separation between these groups is far more likely to lead to conflict than actually bringing them together. But before I go into my second argument, I'll take the closing.
So after Brown v. Board of Education, would it have been more appropriate to force African Americans to go to white schools rather than allowing them the choice and allow social progress from there?
We think that in that situation it's very different because of the historical situation there. But we do think that it would have been much worse if we tried to create 2 systems of equality, or of so-called equality, and had this continued segregation, even if that meant that they were somewhat choosing to be that. We think that that easy choice, while it may seem to be more expedient at the time, would actually have led to the same kind of problems of pillarization, the same kind of problems of segregation that I'm about to talk about. So what am I going to talk about next? The next thing that I'm going to talk about is a government standard for intervention. I think we heard a lot from opening opposition about how the government isn't really justified in solving these sorts of things because the harm of society that's currently happening isn't that great. I think that their arguments were rather shallow when you consider that the tensions that exist in Northern Ireland are still very great, and that the reason why things are improving is precisely because of the forced cooperation that I talked about, and not because of organic changes in society. It's precisely because groups within the society are being forced to cooperate with each other. So at that point, I think that we do have a justification because of the harms in society, and I think that the opening government has done a good job with that. But what we are going to extend into this debate is why government is justified intervening on the ideas of equal opportunity. We say that a presupposition of the liberal state is the idea that individuals are equal. At that point, we think it is perverse that in a liberal state, different individuals have different opportunities to fulfill their life's potential, have different opportunities to actually live their lives. So that at that point, we think that since that is the presupposition of the liberal state, to fulfill that ideal of equality, government is always justified in balancing the idea of liberty, which is another presupposition of the liberal state, with the idea of equality and providing equal opportunities. Why do we think that equal opportunity is at stake in this particular instance in Northern Ireland? Because when you have different schools, we think that it necessarily leads to different opportunities. Because when you have different schools, it becomes much easier for higher authorities to discriminate on the actual quality of the education which is being provided. Now, we are not going to dispute that right now, currently, like ex ante, right now, that the schools in Northern Ireland are relatively similar in certain ways, that the quality of education that they provide is not markedly different. But we'd say that when you continue to have a system of separation, it becomes easier in the future for schools to become markedly different in the quality of education that they provide. And that the habits of separation, which are only going to be reinforced by continued segregation, would only harden the different education that they would be receiving if the schools did change in quality. So we say that by keeping the schools separate, you have more likely to have a system in which schools are different and people have different equality of opportunity. We say this is only magnified by the Dalton system of the Parliament in Northern Ireland. Because under the Dalton system, one party controls the Ministry of Education. One party controls the entire dispersion of education funds. So if Sinn Féin controls the education department, and they know which schools are Catholic schools, we think it would be easy in the future for a political system to discriminate in the allocation of resources in such a way that the equality of opportunity would be abrogated in the future. We say the best way to prevent possible discrimination in the future is to ensure that no future government could discriminate in that kind of funding, precisely because the entire education system would be desegregated, the education system would be integrated, and the interests of all would be through the provision of better education, and it would not be in the interest of any single group. For that reason, we are very proud to propose here.
I thank Alex for that speech, and I call upon Rich to continue the case of the opposition.
I think that we heard a very good example from both sides, the first side of the debate today, about what the problem on the ground is in Northern Ireland. But I think the problem that we're faced with in the back half of the debate today is the fact that neither side has grappled with the actual pragmatics of how to solve this problem. And ultimately, what we hear coming from Second Prod is the danger of going with change. But why is it that they're against change? They don't really tell us. All they say is that we should be concerned about potential hypothetical outcomes in the future. I'm going to tell you why that's not going to be likely, and also why ultimately they see this as happening in the incorrect way. So what I'd like to do today is talk about a few quick issues of rebuttal. I want to talk about the equity of education and what it means to have a quote-unquote compelling government interest, then I want to get into the new substantive matter that Stanford's going to bring you today, the idea of rights and the social outcomes that are likely to occur. So to begin with this idea of the equality of education, ultimately the line here coming out of the side, opening prop, is this idea that there won't be any decrease in the quality of this education, Mr. Speaker. So we have equal resources today, and that they'll all work together, and thank you. But I ask you this, what happens when the parents of these children withdraw their support of these educational systems, when they realize that their children being forced into these groups is going against their will, and they no longer support the system? How will the system continue to work? The line that we hear coming throughout the prop bench is this idea of the compelling government interest. Now, side first proposition gives us some examples. For instance, the idea of physical education, smoking, and drinking, no thank you, as examples of when the government has an interest. And they say that these are analogous. But Mr. Speaker, recognize that these are very different examples. For instance, opponents of smoking are not people who are likely to become militant and to go kill smokers on the streets, right? They don't have a history of doing this. And we think that these are very bad examples. No thank you. You should have picked another better example then. But we think that furthermore, much more importantly, the idea is that the compelling government interest should be to try and not to go along with the ideals and that most of its citizens would go along with. I'll take closing in just a second. And we think that the best way to look at the situation is to say, what do the people in society want? And when we tell you, Mr. Speaker, that both sides currently choose to have separate education systems, even though they have the choice to enter into the other schools, but they choose not to do so, we say that the government, to force them to go in opposite directions, would be to go against the best interest of its citizens. And ultimately, when the social contract says that the government is created by those citizens and is there to serve them, we think it's going in the wrong direction. Sure.
Does closed-op seriously believe that the source of this conflict is mere hatred of neighbors, or do they recognize that the source of the problem was discrimination against one of these groups, and the only way you can solve it is by removing the possibility of discrimination?
Okay, great. So we agree that discrimination is at the root of the problem. But what we're going to tell you today, and I'm going to be getting into the extension very briefly that explains this, is simply that discrimination can't be allowed to continue. The government can't be allowed to discriminate against the majority of society to tell them that they don't have the right to choose, and why this is ultimately the wrong system. No thank you. So I want to go ahead and talk about the idea of rights and social outcomes. And I think that Anish does a great job in rising in his point of information to talk about Brown v. Board of Education, because I think that ultimately side prop mishandles this. I'll take you in just a second. So we think that the issue is that in that case, blacks needed access to white schools. They needed access to the resources. That was being denied to them in the political system. What we would tell you is that ultimately, when these schools were integrated, it was only forced in one sense. It was forced in that the whites did not want the blacks to come into their school. The 7 blacks at the ACLU helped to get into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, all wanted to be in that school, and we think that this is a very critical distinction.
So the US Army created mixed-race units to break down racial barriers within the Army and help racial desegregation. Would you allow whites and blacks to elect to join racially pure units in the Army?
We think that this is a somewhat disanalogous example, because first of all, that was at a time in which society in and of itself, they were not allowed to integrate. They did not have the access to equal rights in society. Your side of the house has been telling us that everyone has equal access to facilities, has equal access to resources, and we think that this is a very important distinction. So what we would tell you is that there are 2 situations. There's a situation in which equal access to rights is not available, and that is when the government should step in and integrate resources. Then you have the example of when rights are available, and the question is more the actions of the members of society as a whole. Now what we're going to tell you on closing opposition today is that in that second example, it's very important to let people recognize these changes on their own and to allow organic change to happen. Why is this? It is because it is the only way to have meaningful change. And I'm going to go ahead and explain in the political example that closing proposition uses that they misunderstand it, and actually that example shows why change coming from a social outcome is most important. We would tell you that ultimately the idea of forced integration should be used only when the political system has failed to give everyone equal access to these rights. In situations such as perhaps during the political struggles that occurred in Northern Ireland, through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, we would tell you, no thank you, that ultimately in this situation, those people were struggling, no thank you, to have representation. We see that there are power sharing agreements existing in the status quo. And their side of the house uniquely agrees that equal access to education already exists. So we think, no thank you, that in the example that we've given you of Brown versus Board of Education, we think it's very clear how these situations are somewhat disanalogous. That the idea of integrating in an army unit also is disanalogous. So the question is, why and when do we give people the right to choose? Now, we're going to tell you on our side of the house that we're not up here trying to defend, no thank you, the idea of segregation as being an especially good thing. But what we will tell you is that our side of the house lies ultimately at the lesser of two evils, because we realize that forcing people to make change doesn't actually change. We realize that they need to recognize the situation on their own. They need to realize that they can coexist with their neighbors. We're not going to tell them that they have to be best of friends. That's not the idea in a political system. A democracy merely aims to have people respect one another's opinions and cooperate together. So we would tell you that ultimately, what happens when you force people together? You get backlash. And we would say, how does this action? It happens in two ways. We would tell you that ultimately, in the long term, if they go with their system of forcing integration, the parties on both sides are going to see that the government is not looking out for their best interests. It's not what they want. It's not what they do when given the choice of the status quo. And what does that mean? They're going to withdraw their support for things like cooperative government, for people working together. It's going to undo the change that we have right now. How did we achieve that change? On their side of the house, they think it's due to ultimately forcing things through. But what we would tell you is that the political example in Northern Ireland tells us simply that people tired of the antics of these situations. The bombing spree of 1998 that killed scores and scores of citizens, ending with 29 in Omagh, ultimately proved that the people were tired of this and that they saw that there was a need for change. It wasn't because it was forced. The parties decided that it was time to compromise, to get together, and to tell you that ultimately in society, you have to let them choose. We give you the avenue to do that on the side closing opposition. Thank you.
I thank Rich for that speech, and I call on Rocky.
Eyeballing these borders all around. Right, thanks, Mr. Speaker. I think that basically what this round comes down to is two things. The first is better facilitating peaceful relations, and the second is facilitating liberty. So first I'm going to talk about facilitating these peaceful relations. So I think that opening GOVT did an absolutely fantastic job of identifying the problem that's actually in place. And OP has never really seen fit to respond to the fact that there even is a problem. But I think that in closing GOVT, we've done an excellent job telling you why this is actually a solution, why we can actually cause some kind of meaningful change, and why, despite the assertions that we get from OP, forcing change in these situations actually can create change, particularly because of the examples that we gave you about when forcing change has in many, many instances actually created similar changes. So they tell us on their side of the house, GOVT never provides us with a mechanism for change. So first I think this is just evidence that they haven't been paying attention to our side at all, particularly my partner's speech, where he gives you numerous instances of why doing this very sort of thing, that is, forcing these two sides to integrate, will not cause them to love each other, but will at the very least force them to peacefully cooperate, or at least teach them how to peacefully cooperate with each other, so that at some point in the future, they might be able to form a better union, a better country, and ultimately a better government. But moreover, I think that we can also say that really, OP never gives us any kind of mechanism for change either. That is, they never actually come up and tell us why on their side of the house, keeping these schools separated, keeping them segregated, is actually going to better facilitate any kind of change, or why at the very least on our side, we create any extra harms. They try to mitigate everything that we say on our side of the house, but at the end of the day, they never tell us why they're actually going to lead to a better end game than we are, why trying nothing is actually going to lead to anything better. All they have to hang their hat on is the notion that there's really not a problem there, which I think is really the root of the problem that we get to on OP in the first place. That they say the problem isn't that bad, so we should just do nothing, let it blow over. But the problem is that bad, and just because we came to a very fortuitous agreement within the past couple of years doesn't necessarily mean that these tensions don't still exist. And we think that at the point when these tensions do exist, and we're not continually moving forward to try to alleviate these tensions, that they can rear their heads in a much uglier way in the future. In this way, at the point where we've made great progress over the past few years, we think that we need to continue to make progress in order to ensure that that progress doesn't take steps backwards in the very near future, in making sure that these sides can indeed coexist. In this way, we think that the only way that we can force these sides to coexist is by allowing the current government to actually be consistent with the rest of the country. Now, why is this the case? Because we think that in the current system with the government, that is what my partner described to you, wherein one sector of the government gets to choose one ministry and then the next gets to choose another ministry and they alternate. It actually makes it very possible for discrimination to still exist in a society that is not also integrated. Why is this? Because, for example, if the school system remains segregated, and then, for example, the Protestant party decides that they want to take over the education ministry, it makes it very easy for the Protestant party to oppress the Catholics. Why is this bad? I'll take you in just one second. Because the reason why the trouble started in the first place is not because there was an intrinsic hatred between these two sides, but because the Catholics felt that they were being inherently oppressed by the Protestants. And the point where you allow that oppression to continue in this very fundamental way, it will allow the troubles to continue and will probably take away much of the progress that we've been able to make over the past few years. I'll take closing.
Okay, so whichever party is currently in control of the Ministry of Education, why is it that forcing it through all of a sudden won't cause huge backlash against that specific community, seeing how they're going to be labeled as responsible and wreck all confidence in a unified government?
Right, so first of all, with these backlash points, again, I would point to the fact that they fundamentally misunderstand why the trouble started. That is, I think that both sides necessarily want there to be a peaceful state. They don't want there to be violence. They don't want to have to worry about people within their own sex dying in these cases. Again, there's not a fundamental hatred. The Catholics just want not to be oppressed. They want there to be some kind of equality in this state. In this case, I think that they would like to see there be a real, true form of equality in the schools. In this case, I don't think that anything they've really said there really stands. But they say forcing people to change doesn't create any real change. So I think that we've already pointed to the example of the current government with Dump, about how we've actually created some kind of real change over the past few years by instituting this kind of government, forcing them to work together in this real meaningful coalition, and then forcing that coalition to actually provide change for the country. But moreover, we tell you that children have fewer biases, that it's actually easier to create this kind of change with children. And we think that if we've been able to do it with adults who throughout their entire lives have been indoctrinated with this kind of conflict, that if we were to do it with children who have less of an indoctrination of bias within them, even if they have some kind of indoctrination of bias, that it should, at least theoretically, be easier to do with children. And we haven't really heard any kind of a contention from side out as to why it wouldn't be easier for children if we have empirically already seen it work with adults. We'll take over.
Sir, but opening never mentioned anything about a curriculum which will force these individuals, or at least teach these individuals, to unite. All they talked about were exposure and sitting beside each other. How did this be?
Right. I think that this POI really reveals the short-sightedness of OP. Because I think that OP feels that the only way that we can possibly get these sides to integrate is if we have some kind of real institutionalized, education curriculum or something like that educates them about the two sides or something like that. The problem in this conflict is not that the two sides don't understand each other, but that they don't know what the other side stands for. The problem is that they simply don't know how to peacefully coexist, that they're brought up in circumstances where they're allowed to segregate so that when they get out of school and they are adults and they're allowed to sort of be the constructors of society, that they remain segregated, that they remain in opposition to these other parties. In this case, if they're forced to desegregate, if they're forced to live peacefully, there's a better chance that when these children grow up to become the constructors of society, that they then decide on their own to desegregate, that they decide to make it a more peaceful nation, that they end this intrinsic bias of conflict, and that these children are no longer forced when they become adults to desegregate because they no longer need to be forced, because they've learned to at least talk to the other side, to be with the other side, and not be at war with the other side. This is the fundamental problem, and the fact that OP doesn't think this is enough shows that OP doesn't understand the conflict. Very quickly, I want to talk a little bit about facilitating liberties, something that we really don't get a lot of response to on this side. They say that it's a choice, that we should allow these children to go to the schools that they want to. They say the outcomes of Brown v. Board of Education only came because blacks chose to go to school with whites. First, I really hope they've got a better example on whip speech than Brown v. Board of Education, this U.S. Supreme Court case that stems from a history far different than the history that we're dealing with in Northern Ireland. Second, I would point out the inherent contradiction that earlier they said that the minority wouldn't want to go to school with the majority, that there'd be some kind of inherent backlash. Then they point to Brown v. Board of Education, where at the point when the schools were desegregated, the minority chose to go to school with the majority. So I don't see how these two examples can coexist. But third, I think that they're insinuating on their side of the house that this is truly a choice. That is, that if the Catholics wanted to, they could go to school with the Protestants. We don't necessarily think that it is a choice. Because no Catholic would ever go to a Protestant school because it would basically be suicide, right? If it's an inherently coerced choice, this is one of the prongs by which we say that the government is allowed to invade in these situations, where they can truly make it a choice, where the Catholics can go to these schools because they're no longer completely outnumbered. This is a circumstance that the government needs to provide if they truly want equality. Equality is not just saying, well, you can either go into this perfectly fine house or this burning building, your choice. Obviously, we want to give people reasonable choices to choose from. If we do this, we create a better and more just society. For all these reasons, we're very, very proud to propose.
I thank Zoki for that speech, and I call upon Anish to conclude the case for the opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think that despite all the acrimony we've seen so far, both sides of this House are in broad agreement on two points. One, it's quite a shame that Catholics and Protestants today in Northern Ireland do have this lingering acrimony. We would like to see a future in which Catholics and Protestants get along together. And we would like to have a government that acts in a manner that facilitates these two societies coming together and reconciling within Northern Ireland. I think that the fundamental distinction between the two sides of the houses today is an understanding of how change occurs. Because we think that the fundamental contention that's being made today by side proposition is that change occurs from the top down. That is, a government will make the decision that we're going to ensure that these two sides are going to be reconciled, and essentially force them to reconcile in schools. And that, they believe, will in turn lead to reconciliation. Today, Stanford presents you with a very different picture of how change occurs, and we believe a far more realistic picture of how change occurs. Because we don't think that governments tell their people what to do, but rather, people tell their governments what to do. And that change will only occur when the people of these societies want to reconcile. And indeed, what we contend is that prematurely forcing them from the top down will actually create a backlash that will make ultimate reconciliation less likely in the future. So with that, I want to talk about two major areas. First, the backlash that propositions policy would create, and why they fundamentally misunderestimate, in the words of our president, unfortunately, what this would do to that society. And second, I want to do into a discussion of how societal attitudes truly shift, and why opposition today gives you the correct picture of how that change is going to occur. So, first let's talk a little bit about backlash. Because essentially, we get the notion today from both sides, but particularly we think from opening proposition, that if they wave their magic debate wand and simply put these two people in a room long enough, there's simply going to be some sort of reconciliation. Now, this might, and I emphasize might be true, if all there were in the society is children living in a society where they were forcing to interact. But I think that they forget that this society still has adults in it. And this is something that Rich points out to you that they never grapple with on closing up opposition to it. Because here's the point. Recognize that right now, both sides are by themselves choosing to live in segregated educational communities. Now, at the very end of his speech, the whip for the other side does contest this, but recognize they're reading from yesterday's script. In today's environment, people aren't killing people who are going to the other side of school. There is some sort of functional choice. It just happens to be that because of the biases that are being transmitted between generations, they just are choosing to go to the schools of their own religious sect. But what does that mean? It means that adults in both communities will be angry when the government takes away their right to choose what school they're going to and what sort of religious communities they're being affiliated with. What does that mean? They will start to lose trust in the government. Now, they recognize on their side of the house today that the political reconciliation that's occurred ever since the Good Friday Peace Accords is a relatively recent development. That means that the peace in the governmental arena right now is relatively fragile. What we believe then is you should not endanger that peace by causing the society to lose trust in unified government. Because at that point, these people might stop believing in the society in which the two sides can coexist, which we think fundamentally undermines everything both sides of this house are trying to achieve today. I'll take you.
All right, you keep to think that this sort of thing can only be imposed by one party. But isn't it true that all of the changes in Northern Ireland were brought about by a top governmental institution, that is the government of Britain, essentially forcing these changes on Northern Ireland?
No. Look, if they all of a sudden said, hey guys, we're going to force you to stop bombing each other, and we're going to force you to respect each other's rights, if the people of that society fundamentally disagreed with that government, they would continue bombing each other, and they would continue disrespecting each other's rights. It's only when the people of that society believed that the other side had rights, and believed that they were sick and tired of violence, that their representatives, the government, were able to codify that in law. That is fundamentally what the proposition has failed to understand today, that governments are representative of the wills of the people, and you force the government to take an action. And it doesn't have to be just a parliamentary Catholics. It could be that members of both parties force the communities to take this action. But at the point that they're at odds with the opinions of their communities, those representatives will lose sway, which means you're going to get more radical, more sectarian individuals in government, and perhaps no longer a unified government at all, which ultimately shoots your policy of reconciliation and integration in the foot before it ever gets started. That's the result of that. We don't think it's going to be successful. Moreover, we think that they do an inadequate job of addressing the fact that there is going to be a parental backlash. What does that mean? One, they're going to try and more explicitly ensure that their children are not interacting with the other side. Now, we get this response very glibly that this can't really be possible. but we think it is absolutely possible. One, there are such things as private schools, at which point the government has no jurisdiction. So at the point where these parents still are willingly taking their kids into segregated communities, if they can't do it in government arenas, then they're going to forcefully do it in private arenas. Here's the thing though, people are much more likely to take that sort of action when they think that they're under threat in terms of the actions that they take. Now, it's much more likely that they'll continue to go to the public arena when they think that indeed their rights are being respected. And in these public arenas, they're far more likely to encounter someone of the opposite religion than they are going to encounter in a private school. Now, I want to talk about how societal attitudes shift. Because essentially what they tell you is that, look, all we have to do is get a bunch of stodgy old men in a room to sign a document, and societal attitude shifts. But again, we think that the political example is not at all applicable. Why? Because we think that that political change only occurred once the people on the ground had accepted that change first. That's why we think all the political examples don't work. Now, they think that at the end of the day, if you just force these people to sit together long enough, there is going to be some sort of change in the long run. But here's the problem. We think that ultimately that's not going to occur, and we think that the example of Brown versus the Board of Education is particularly relevant. Why? Because recognize that had we, instead of giving African Americans the choice to go to white schools, forced African Americans to go to white schools, the situation would have been drastically different. Why? Because recognize that shortly after Brown versus the Board of Education, most African Americans continued to go to African American schools because that's where they felt comfortable. But what happened? Over time, as some people went to the other side school, social attitudes changed slowly. That led to further and further integration. Had you forced it at the outset using a quota system like they're proposing, the whites would have been very angry, and the backlash would have been far greater, which would have led to more hatred between the two sides, and reignited violence, something that we think is a very high likelihood of occurring right now. Instead, what we see right now is gradual change. Already, some Protestants are going to Catholic schools, and some Catholics are going to Protestant schools. And as society becomes more and more comfortable with that motion over a gradual pace, that is only going to continue, and history has taught us that that will continue towards ultimate reconciliation. Instead, what they want you to do is put the cart before the horse and jeopardize the entire process. We are very proud to oppose.
Thank you all very much. If you could go outside and shake hands and whatever, we'll call you back in.